Hello and welcome to our learning series on Agile Transformation, a learning series brought to you by Sternbridge Technology Consulting. I'm the host, Kenny Gibbons, and I'll be taking you through this learning course. So it's great to have you on board. If you enjoyed the series, please give us a like or subscribe so you can know when our newest episodes drop. Sit back, relax, and enjoy our course on Agile. Welcome to today's episode 2 of our learning series. Today I will discuss Agile fundamentals. In the last episode, we gave a quick overview of the course and some background on my experience. So if you'd like to understand more about the goals of the course, go back and watch episode 1. Because of the density of the information in this topic, this episode will be broken into 4 parts, covering each of the topics. So make sure to watch all 4 parts to get a complete overview on Agile fundamentals. Today I will discuss Agile principles, why Agile was created in the first place, and common Agile methodologies and frameworks. So without further ado, let's get started with today's topic. When giving an Agile fundamentals course, we need to start somewhere. For Agile, that starting point is pretty straightforward, the Agile manifesto. Agile, as it pertains to software development, was coined in February 2001. And this term was coined after 17 developers met to discuss software development practices. These developers had been industry experts and had varying schools of thought on the best way to develop software and had grown frustrated with the current organizational and industry thinking. And it's very important to understand the context of this situation. It's 2001, arguably the peak of the dot-com bubble. Companies are investing heavily in developing software solutions, but these developers were seeing common struggles and failure points for how these companies were doing so. Thus, they got together and created the Agile manifesto. Now, this Agile manifesto does not outline frameworks or methodologies that you may have heard, like Scrum or Kanban or extreme programming, but instead it focuses on core principles that should be applied in how software is developed. Coming from Agile manifesto, these principles then got created. Now, they came up with 4 overarching core principles that laid the foundation for all of the Agile thinking to date, even 24 years later. The first core principle was individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And really what they're trying to hone in on here is allowing individuals, getting them together, talking, really defining how they work together in a team versus trying to create really concrete and rigid processes or force-fitting tools because of organizational guardrails or guidelines. The second core principle is working software over comprehensive documentation. There is a really big demand here around making sure software works. There was a lot of time being spent on design, on requirements, and you're even seeing that in today's time and a lot of the way that organizations are approaching technology now. But really forcing software to work, making sure that if multiple developers are working on different areas of the code, that they are at some point, and ideally as quickly as possible, merging those together and making sure it works together and not just working by themselves. The third piece here is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. You can use customer collaboration. Think of this as your end users. Who are the ones using the software? Making sure there's collaboration with them so that the technology teams and the people developing software are not just going off in kind of a silo, building something, waiting 6 months and coming back. So really trying to build that customer collaboration and all of that kind of team energy together as quickly, as actively as possible. And then lastly, responding to change over following a plan. And there's a balance here in how this gets approached, but really one of the things, and we'll talk about it with the waterfall side, is making sure that as the delivery process goes on, that there's ways to respond to changing requirements or even evolving technology stacks that you're seeing in, let's say, the AI space where things are changing on a month-to-month basis. How do you ensure that the processes and the framework that you use, the team can respond to take advantage over new information or new technology that is out there? Coming out of those 4 core principles, they added additional 12 that then kind of double click into each one of those core principles. So the first one here is around the highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And this is a really important theme. You'll see it come up in all the frameworks But we highlighted here satisfy the customer. At the end of the day, in the software development world, if the business isn't adopting your software, it doesn't bring value to what you're trying to deliver. Core number 2 here is welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. One of the biggest things, especially when we talk about the waterfall process, is it was a very rigid process where it was really hard to change once requirements were defined. A lot of good agile framework implementations allow for controls in place to ensure that changes can take place and can take place in a very active and open way. And this is a really key aspect of this. In my time in the industry, a lot of times customers are changing what they want as they see more and more working software or as they have new ideas. And you need to foster and build that collaboration to build effective working software. Number 3 here was deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference to the shorter the time scale. So the frameworks and methodologies that came out of these 12 principles here, you'll see a common trend of trying to deploy and deliver value as quickly as possible through small, bite-sized chunks. And the reason for this, I've seen it in my experience in working with multiple software teams, is you really don't know how the software is going to work until it comes together. A lot of times when it comes together, there's a lot of problems and defects that get created just from not seeing the process the full way through in the system, or developers working in silos, and having this continual kind of forced merge allows for a lot of those kinks to be worked out during the process versus waiting until the very end when you're a week away from trying to ship that software out. Number 4 is super critical. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. I see this a lot in actually failed agile projects where the business, and a lot of times in the corporate mode, the business here are the end users that are driving the actual business. They have a minimal background in technology, and they're not collaborating with the software team, which is part of the change management that we'll talk to as we talk about scaling in an organization. If business people, effectively the end users and the people that manage the business processes, are not spending time to work with the developers and with the product team within every phase of the project, this agile kind of way of working will really move more so into a waterfall way very quickly without having that cooperative and collaborative approach. The number 5 principle is build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. You'll see later on in this learning series, we'll cover some of the challenges in agile implementations, and this one comes up frequently. Organizations and leadership need to build an environment where the team can effectively focus on their work and on developing the software. Large enterprises that are used to operating in a waterfall and a reporting heavy environment like the waterfall process because it is very easy to follow stage gates and report on progress of completing those stage gates. Agile blurs those lines, and executive level upper management can start to get nervous as they're not always clear and decisive stage gates. In my experience, when that trust starts to dissipate, project teams become more focused on trying to report upwards instead of focusing on the software. Leadership needs to be able to trust that the team is motivated and working on the right things and ultimately working towards the same direction and goals set forth in the strategy. It is the organization's job to carve out the space and trust for the team to be successful. Core principle number 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. Now, in today's modern world, we have come a long way in approaching the digital hybrid workplace. But with that being said, there's still a lot to gain in face-to-face conversation, but knowing that's not always available because of today's global teams. So, what we can also see in some agile frameworks that work well is a hybrid approach where you may not all be located to work together, but the team tries to get co-located once a quarter, once a semester to do planning, prioritization, and to ultimately get aligned. When you're face-to-face, that's where you uncover a lot more. It's a lot easier to accomplish objectives in a focused environment versus in our day-to-day where there could be conflicting meetings, messages, emails, or other tasks that take us away from our focus. So it's always important to try to have some element of face-to-face communication, even if it's not always feasible to be physically located on a day-to-day or a weekly basis. And you really see that come out in some of the agile frameworks, especially in the scaling side of things, as we'll talk through in some further lessons. Number 7 is working software is the primary measure of success. And I talked about this in one of the previous principles around making sure that the team has the right environment and focusing on the right things to be successful and ultimately having trust in the team doing so. And in that principle, I talked about how organizations can get hung up in getting into a more focused reporting cycle versus focusing on what are they ultimately trying to deliver value for. And this core principle here really builds upon that. And as part of this, by following the principle, the teams can prioritize and focus on additional software delivery practices that you may have heard of, like continuous integration and continuous delivery. And those practices allow software code to be rapidly deployed and tested, ideally as frequently as possible. You may hear of things in the industry like daily releases or daily builds, and this is really following this continuous integration, continuous delivery process around getting working software as quickly as possible so that you can test and use. And by teams merging the software code frequently, it really also allows other teams to ensure that the functionality is working correctly as early as possible in the process. In other approaches that I've seen, and I know we talked a lot about waterfall, and we'll talk a little bit more before we jump into agile frameworks. By waiting until the end of the development cycle to bring and merge all this code together, it can really cause a lot of problems and challenges. On project implementations that I've done, if I don't see working software, ideally months before the delivery timeline, depending on the scope, it really starts to make me nervous. I've had experience where we are due to go live in a month, but large features are still being developed and haven't been merged. In these scenarios, I always expect multiple weeks to test and ensure the software is working properly once those features are merged. And I don't think that is against the industry norms, because the more siloed and branched off software becomes, the harder it is to bring it back together and the more problems that will occur when doing so. And you see this a lot as functionality starts to drift off of the main code. When you bring that in, there's a lot of problems in bringing that together, a lot of edge cases that maybe developers didn't see, a lot of edge cases that maybe testers didn't even understand. So the quicker that you can get that software working, tested in the hands of users, the better. Because ultimately, working software should allow teams and leadership to measure progress, pace, and ability to meet the committed timelines that are out there. The number 8 principle is agile processes promote sustainable development. Sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Now, in my experience, and a lot of times in software development in big organizations, there's a lot of commitments that executives make, and a lot of those commitments are very hard to achieve in a sustainable way. So you'll see these sprints, not in a scrum manner, but more of a 6-month sprint to deliver the software as quickly as possible to try to get to that go live point or where that commitment was made. Now, even if the team is successful, what I see a lot of times is there's a high degree of burnout that will become prevalent after that go live or after that milestone is achieved. And to continue the next phase of releases or to continue to support the software, you almost need to switch out the team because you just burn out all of the original members. Now, this principle is the antithesis of that scenario. Software development pace is to be able to be sustained forever. And when you have to roll off or change a team because of burnout, you lose a lot of that inherent knowledge, the previous context, all the discussions and decisions that were made in that software development process. So ultimately, agile software delivery planning methodologies should be utilized to ensure that you can maintain this pace forever. And realistically, maybe forever isn't always possible in the real world, but at least a goal of a year or 2 years of sustainable pace really should be the goal for organizations. Core principle 9 is continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. One of the common misconceptions I've heard in my experience is that with Agile, you don't need requirements or good upfront technical design. These are the projects that end up taking on massive amounts of technical debt and end up struggling to scale and be successful long term. The better the design principles in place and the guidelines created up front, the better the solution will be as it matures through the Agile process and as the Agile process takes hold. On one of my projects, We actually made some poor architecture decisions to start, and this served as a basis for our data model for our software. We ended up needing to develop around that decision for the lifecycle of the project, and this single decision created a ton of work for us to accommodate this upfront architectural decision. Now, all that could have been avoided if we spent time upfront focusing on technical design inputs and principles versus just making a decision and developing the software. Now, before moving to the next point, I do want to say there's a balance here. Sometimes you need to make a decision to move forward based on the information that's available and then reassess at a later time when more information or user feedback is understood. And this is really where the Agile process shines. I'll talk about it in one of the upcoming principles, but I've also seen teams get stuck in an analysis paralysis loop where significant time is spent deliberating on how to handle and design for unvetted edge cases and future scenarios. Now, with that being said, if there's a focus on always providing technical excellence and good design, those design principles and technical principles should help give the pathway to the development team to kind of follow and be successful. And following kind of the agile principles and process, those should continue to be assessed and modified and changed as needed as the product evolves and as the requirements and customers begin providing more feedback and more maturity in the process. Principle 10. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. Prioritization and not overcomplicated functionality is really the focus of this agile principle. In following agile processes, I like to look at upcoming work through a lens of ruthless prioritization. Looking at what are our priorities for the upcoming work, what is the true user need of this functionality, and how can we simplify it? What is the smallest unit of functionality that we can create to meet the user need so that we can develop it and get it into the hands of the user as quickly as possible? Once the user is using it and we see it in action in the application, we can then reevaluate if more bells and whistles should be added to make the functionality be more effective. Now, there are ways to create efficiencies in this process by using good user experience practices and principles, creating mockups and designs, and following good user design approaches before the feature goes into development. And we'll talk more about that when we deep dive into the agile roles and responsibilities. But ultimately, keeping things as simple as possible. I've heard things apply like KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I've been in a lot of conversations with development teams where we'll talk through the requirement and we'll start over engineering and really starting to think about edge cases. And if we think about core agile principles, the goal is bring value back to the customer, back to the business as quickly as possible. And this is the intent of focusing in on what is that value? How can we get it to market quicker? Principle 11, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. This principle applies to how agile teams operate, but it's also very important for scaling agile frameworks. When implementing agile, you want to ensure that you have the right people and the right roles in place for achieving that agile methodology. Understanding that with the right roles and skill sets in place, the team should be able to be self-organized and be able to run by themselves. Additionally, with these self-organizing teams, they should be able to have flexibility to do what's best for that team. And this is really important when deploying agile techniques and frameworks across an organization. I've been part of agile transformations within large companies where a specific methodology is selected and that company tries to implement that methodology verbatim. If a process is put in place, but it isn't flexible enough in how some of the work is done, it won't be adopted across the organization and across those teams that need to apply that methodology. Teams should be able to apply methodology, ensuring that organizational guidelines are adhered to, ultimately so the organization runs in tune and on the same beat, but teams should have the flexibility to adjust and self-organize as needed. Each team should effectively become their own pod, with organizational support and dependencies accommodated as needed. And good frameworks have processes in place to help bring about that conversation and ensure that the organization as a whole stays connected. So when looking at Agile, it's also good to pick a methodology that works for the organization and for the team. This methodology will provide guidelines and standards for modes of operating within the Agile process, but you also need to understand and keep in mind that no matter what, you will need to be flexible in how that methodology gets applied to your team. Every Agile team is different. Every Agile team has different skill sets, has different personalities. And that is ultimately the beauty of having a cross-functional Agile team. And these frameworks and methodologies should enable those teams and not create processes that are so strict to where those teams ultimately can't be self-organizing and doing what's best to deliver working software that is valuable and meaningful for customers. And lastly, the 12th core principle. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts that behavior. In similar terminology, you may have heard this concept called continuous improvement, or in other Agile approaches, things like retrospectives. It's important to make sure that there's guidelines here to allow the team to assess how they've been operating and ultimately how they can improve to be more effective in the future. It's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and all the deliverables that are always hanging above our heads as teams. Ultimately, carving out the space here to do these retrospectives or these look backs, and then figuring out how can I improve the process and the team moving forward based on our learnings is crucial. And there's varying ways to do this, and different frameworks prescribe different approaches to it. But ultimately, that fundamental principle is still there. Looking back, analyzing what worked, what didn't work, and figuring out how can I improve and ensure that those processes sustain throughout the future of our software delivery. And that's a wrap on the 12 core principles of the Agile manifesto. Because no matter what kind of software implementation is done, what framework you use, these principles are always at the core of both successes and challenges within an organization. And I would recommend anytime as an organization or you personally are starting a new software implementation or a new process, I would always come back to these principles because they're a really good roadmap for delivering value, working software, and how you can ensure that your team and organization can work as effectively as possible in the Agile way. Before starting to cover the next phase of this Agile fundamental episode, we're going to end part 1 here. In part 2, we are going to cover what some would say competes with Agile: waterfall methodology, including common challenges that led to the Agile manifesto. In the later parts, we will give an introduction to Scrum frameworks and common Agile challenges. Not all of this is blue sky and roses. Agile also has pitfalls and challenges that get associated with it too, and it's important to understand this as we talk about the Agile fundamentals and then ultimately how to apply those fundamentals into organizations. So with that, I'm Kenny Gibbons, and thanks for listening to our course on Agile transformation. Hope you have a great day. Tune in for our next episode part 2 on Agile fundamentals.